Does anybody have a question?
Okay, just as you closed, you used a phrase that I was thinking I was going to ask you about, the racialized tension and so on. To what degree, in looking at the Ground Zero controversy, do you think that the controversy became racialized rather than religionized, if you will? I mean,
That's a very good question. I think, well, there are two aspects to that. There's the larger question of whether Muslims are becoming racialized as a category instead of religionized,
Yep.
which I think you can argue on both sides of that debate, actually. In American studies, a lot of people like to argue that the new salience is a racial framework. But in religious studies, and myself personally, some of us argue that ideas about race, we can see historically, came out of prejudices that were religious, that existed before racial prejudices. So, so the idea that race is the most salient category kind of denies this history of the fact that tensions have existed before the ideas about scientific racism that we now have, and they were based. These racist ideas came out of religious prejudice to begin with. So I just want to resist trying to disentangle those two. But and I don't think you were trying to disentangle them. Yeah, they are obviously entangled. Right. But I think
analytically it's useful.
Yeah, I think there's a jockeying to argue about which one is more important, which category is more important, which I'm not sure I necessarily find that helpful. If people find it helpful for illuminating something and coming up with a political project, I'm all about that. But for myself, I don't necessarily find it helpful to think of this just or more in terms of race than in religion at this point.
Now, just as a follow-up then on this isation fixation that analysts seem to have, the current favoritization, even in terms of looking at Islamophobia, is now securitization.
Mm-hmm.
And that would you say that it was race and religion, but to what degree was the fears that were aroused over the mosque controversy, to what degree did those fears get aroused by turning it into a security issue rather than a race issue or a religious issue?
Well, the security issue is a cover for racial and religious, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, obviously, because Department of Homeland Security analysts have been saying over and over again that the threat of violence that most Americans face is not the greatest threat of violence, is not from would-be Islamic terrorists. It's from white nationalists who've killed twice as many people in this country as any so-called radicalized Muslim since 9/11. And so even the discourse on securitization, in order to make it about Muslims, you have to hide the fact that there's more violence by other people that's happening more commonly. So that's an important question as well. But I do want to mention, I've written about this in the AAR article that I'm hoping is not too theoretical. The idea of
you want to keep it a little bit theoretical.
Yeah, but not too obtuse, I hope. The idea that there is something called Islamic fundamentalism actually comes out of some fairly explicit anti-Arab bias. So this idea about Islamic fundamentalism now being a broader category that gets applied all over the place. This testifies what I was saying about the entanglement of these things and the ways you just can't pull them apart. But I wanted to answer your question another way, your first question about the racialization. The conflict about the community center that didn't get exposed nearly as much was the internal conflict among Muslim Americans and Muslims in New York City about this community center. And this was highly racialized and class-inflected because the community center was meant to be a community center along the lines of the Jewish community center, which has a swimming pool and yoga and Spanish classes and etc. And this is how the leaders of the project kept promoting it. So that's fine if you're trying to get grants from the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation, who is giving redevelopment funds from the state to organizations in the community to redevelop downtown Manhattan, and that's what they were trying to do. But that's not the kind of community service that many Muslim Americans were seeking, particularly not Muslim Americans who'd been disenfranchised again by what was then an ongoing economic crisis. And so this was especially true for Black American populations because the wealth, the economic recession that started in 2007, 2008, wiped out, according to post-recession estimates, 3 generations of wealth in African American communities. So for those communities, community service didn't need to be yoga. It didn't need to be, it needed to be something else. And so that was part of what prevented Abdul Rauf and the leaders of that project from getting support more broadly among the community in New York. Not to mention the fact that they had long cultivated allies with religious leaders of other persuasions, and they'd spent more time doing that kind of inter-religious work than intra-religious work. And so they didn't have as strong ties as they could have when they started that project to begin with other Muslim communities in the area.
What happened to the Cordoba initiative in the ground zero mosque? You don't hear anymore.
Yeah, you don't.
It
I
just
know.
disappeared.
No, Park 51, it exists, right?
Park 51 is what it was reinvented as. And so there was yet another debate about what community service means actually and what this project, even among the leaders of that project, Abdul Rauf and Daisy Khan, his wife and co-director of the Cordoba initiative, they decided that they wanted to make it a multi-faith place that was meant to demonstrate healing, and that its proximity to the 9/11 attacks was not incidental but symbolic of a new era of what could come out of this, a new interreligious commonality. But the other developers who owned the property, which were actually their Sufi dervishes, or Abdul Rauf's Sufi dervishes, they had long been listening to Abdul Rauf say, Muslim Americans are as American as anybody else. And they were like, we're as American as anybody else. We are not going to make this an interreligious project. There's no reason we have to turn this into an interfaith project to please everybody. We can show by keeping it a Muslim project that Muslim Americans are as patriotic as anybody else. And so this also rippled the matrix for them, and the divide between them really hampered efforts to fundraise for the project at a really crucial moment. So the Cordoba initiative, which was Abdul Rauf's creation, still exists, and he's still working from it and promoting his work and the idea of Abrahamic commonality. But he's actually shifted, and he had shifted before the mosque controversy. He shifted toward international work and working on the authenticity of various Muslim majority nations' legal frameworks, the Islamic authenticity of them. So that's what he's been mostly focusing on, and he hadn't really been focusing on the American aspect as much by the time this controversy happened. And the other developers who owned the property and changed it to the name of Park 51 after the street address, 51 Park Street, they are not religious leaders, they're property developers. And so they've tried to connect with different religious leaders and tried to get this project off the ground, but as successive financial and leadership challenges have ensued, they've scaled back the project in many different ways. And so it was supposed to be a 13-story center, and then it became maybe a 4 or 5-story, and then maybe it's just going to be a couple stories of a museum with a prayer space underneath. And that's kind of where it's at the moment, as they've gone through different acting directors and haven't yet formalized anything.
Books that are available. Well, wait till the people to ask. If you want, I'll ask the question. We have copies of the book available if you want to buy them. The books are where? Here? Okay, so if you want to leave and buy one on the way out, go for it.
And I just want to add that all the proceeds from this book go to the Center for Constitutional Rights, which is an organization that Leila, actually Al-Arian, and I am on the board of. And in my opinion, that's the organization that has done the most in New York City to work against some of the invasive surveillance campaigns of Muslims, as well as working on behalf of other dispossessed communities. So
Did
the money.
CCR have some high-profile case recently?
A bunch of them.
Yeah, which one?
Before the Supreme Court.
Yeah, but what was the most high-profile one?
Probably the one before the Supreme Court.
Yeah, the one
was?
before the Supreme Court. The name got changed, and I don't remember what the new name is, but it's trying.
Abbasi.
Yeah, Abbasi. And I was going to say V. Holder, but every time the Attorney General changes, the name changes, plus the plaintiffs change. It was basically trying to hold Bush administration officials accountable for the torture architecture that they had created to try to elicit information from detainees. So that's the most high-profile one that just went before the Supreme Court not long ago. But there are also more local ones, as I mentioned, dealing with Muslims in New York City.
One brief question and one which might lead to more discussion. You mentioned the connection between Baroudi and Gingrich and Muhammad al-Rauf at the American Enterprise Institute. Was Baroudi a Muslim, or was he an Arab Christian? Or
He was an Arab Christian.
Yeah.
He was a Lebanese Christian.
Not surprising. Okay, the other is, you mentioned Irving Kristol as an example of a neoliberal assimilationist Jew. Do you discuss at all Mordecai Kaplan?
I don't.
Yeah, who's well known as the founder of Reconstructionism, but he also was one of the co-authors of a book, I think that dated in the 50s, called The Religion of Democracy. And it sounds like it would be quite relevant to the points you're raising.
Yeah, these were not unique authors. The ones that I mentioned, they were not unique in the kinds of work that they were producing. This was a phenomenon that was happening more broadly, and I think you just illustrated that. And I will say, since Triple IT is one of the groups that invited me, Ismail al-Faruqi had at one point written about democracy and capitalism and Islam's compatibility with them. But he also wrote about, incarcerated Black American prison populations, So he had a more multifaceted perspective on these issues. But he did, say at one point that, like, Muslims could have been like the Puritans, as far as these theologies of wealth went. It kind of depends on where you take that after that point.
So, hi. Thank you for the presentation. My question is relating to how widely have you seen these kinds of discourses which sanction or justify or say that Islam is compatible with Islam, with democracy and capitalism? And I ask this because, for example, if you look at the discourses, figures like Hamza Yusuf, he would not necessarily say it so explicitly, perhaps. I don't know of any particular books where he promotes this in a special fashion. However, he does do this thing where he will go with Dembélé and take him on these tours to Davos and whatever else, and essentially kind of taking the system as it is as something benign. And then when it comes to talking about, let's say, socialism or social justice movements, Black Lives Matter and whatever else, he then talks about materialist metaphysics and having to be opposed to all this atheistic, without kind of tackling the fact that a lot of the liberalism, which he sometimes in passing even just kind of endorses, will be based on a similarly materialist metaphysics. So there's this going on, and how this also transfers onto his critique of Salafism, politicized Salafism certainly, and Islamism, which in its kind of teleology from Muslim Brotherhood to ISIS echoes something which has become very mainstream in the city discourse of people like Trump and people in his administration. So I know it's maybe a big question or a few questions kind of tied together.
How does it echo?
Or how broadly is it? You were asking how broadly at first the discourse is.
So basically whether there's any kind of similarity or that you have kind of noticed in this kind of discourse of, let's say, people like Abu Rauf. And I mean, there is obviously some kind of parallel with what's going on with Hamza Yusuf, but is there any maybe deeper kind of connection in some way? Are they influenced by the same people? Is there any structural reason for this, etc.?
I know that Abdul Rauf's book, when it came out, was handed out at major Muslim American organizations' conventions. So there was a heavy promotion of this book, and I've seen from those conventions, some of their advertisements about entrepreneurialism and holding workshops on entrepreneurialism. There's definitely a current of this that has become almost standard and, like you said, just kind of naturalized as very benign. And the history behind these frameworks isn't necessarily known. But I've also seen in the last few years, particularly last year, a kind of turn in some of those major national organizations, like the Islamic Society of North America, for example, started sponsoring a social justice tour and having Siraj Wahaj and Linda Sarsour talking, in different locations about things. And Linda Sarsour is behind one of the organizations that I think that is trying to pioneer this more integrated, connected work, which is the Empower Collective. Muslim Power is what it stands for. And so I think I would certainly not be the first to call out the existence of this kind of understanding within Muslim American communities prior to the current political administration. I think because of the recession and because of the rhetoric of the presidential campaign, the 2016, which started in 2015 presidential campaign, and because of a lot of the violence that we saw that gave rise to the Black Lives Matter movement, I think a lot of that galvanized people who had just taken these, Muslim Americans who had taken these things for granted before. And they really began, and of course, the Ground Zero Mosque controversy that revealed, to many people that there is nativism and anti-Islamic fervor in this country that can easily be tapped into and fueled. And so all of these things together, I think, disrupted the naturalness of this economic framework and this American exceptionalism about America just being better and better and everybody assimilates and everybody gets accepted.
Well, thank you very much for a wonderful lecture. In the subtitle of the book, you mentioned Sufism. There was very little of it in the lecture. So can you elaborate a little bit? What is the place and role of Sufism in all of this?
This is something that, this is part of what I actually started the project with, which was to see how this idea that I mentioned, the assistant imam saying to me that how Sufism promotes interreligious unity, how that got taken to be verified as truth and as the singular meaning of Sufism for American political elites. And so that's something that I talk about in the middle of the book. It's also something that I've written about elsewhere. And it's something that my next project is going to be more devoted to, because this research came out of this 200-page book, came out of a 600-page dissertation that was partly about that and about how that gets started during the Cold War, actually. Gets started with scholars who are trying to promote Sufism as the key to modern Islam. And this goes back to what I said about anti-Arab sentiment kind of being behind the idea of fundamentalism. The same scholars that kind of coined the term fundamentalism believed these very Orientalist ideas, that Arabs were very rigid in their understandings of Islamic law and that they were not very flexible, and that on the other hand, Aryans, and these were very Orientalist categories, they didn't mean it in the neo-Nazi sense, they meant it in the Orientalist sense, like Indian and then Pakistani and Persian, that they were more flexible and creative because they had been exposed to Sufism. And if you could only get the Sufism to influence the rigid Arab mindset, then you could come up with this orthodox and yet simultaneously liberal Islam that would be the Islam for the modern world, right? So this happens in the 1950s that these scholars are working on this. They're getting funding from private foundations whose foundation officers used to be in the precursor to the CIA. And it's not one big conspiracy theory, but there are a lot of connections that lead to a certain idea of Islam being translated into American intelligence and security and political circles. But it doesn't take the kind of the force that it had before the Ground Zero Mosque controversy until recently. It didn't take that kind of self-evident force really until the 1990s. And at that point, the State Department held a conference in which they were talking about Islamic extremism, and a Lebanese immigrant who was a sheikh who was trying to build relations for his community in the United States went to this conference the State Department held and said, "I've been to hundreds of mosques." Yeah. And 90% of them are extremist, filled with fundamentalists. And this is what you hear Peter King quoting when he's castigating Abdul Rauf. He's like, even though Abdul Rauf is a Sufi, right? But anyway, so he was doing that. He was saying that to make alliances for Sufis, and this gets taken by the Bush administration and the Obama administration as gospel. And so they began promoting domestically and especially internationally Sufism as the good Islam.
I think that, you probably already went back and looked at this, but I think you can also trace it back to the kind of 1892-93 Chicago Conference on Religion, and the only Muslims who are actually involved are this, I think his name Pir Inayatullah, I think this one from India, and then
Inayat Khan. Yeah, he's a little later, but yeah.
And then he writes this book, which is, actually you got a first edition of it at some bookstore from like 1911 or something, and it's about, if you read it, it's this sort of transcendental unity of religions, sort of, for lack of a better word, fluffy, kumbaya religion, and that's the only Islam people accept, and it's Sufi Islam.
And they weren't. That's a very important moment in the history, and I do touch on that in the book. they weren't accepting it as Islam, which is the important
Yeah.
point. They were disaggregating Sufism
It's like
and
Madonna
from
and
Islam.
Kabbalah or something.
Exactly, right. That's exactly it. So it was important for a certain subset of elites in the United States who were gravitating toward this, but they were like, but that's not Islam. This is just Sufism. And even Inayat Khan wasn't insisting that what he did was Islam. He was like,
Yeah.
it's just Sufism, you know? And so, but that was a kind of rarefied moment. And then it's the 1960s counterculture where people pick it up again and it gets more broadly.
But another thing I remember,
accepted.
which was fascinating, it's one of the sort of gems that Suleiman Yang provides. Where he said, this is the first time I ever heard it, he said all this stuff, all these Muslim organizations in America started in the Cold War, and he said he's a lot older than he looks, but I mean he and a lot of these other kind of immigrants who founded all these organizations were brought to the U.S. in the 1950s, 60s, 70s by the U.S. government as part of an effort to build up anti-Soviet, anti-atheist links with the Muslim world.
Mm-hmm.
So what's ironic is that just as the sort of Sufism is seen as the moderate Islam, also the same people that someone like Kabani would be criticizing, namely like Islamist movement people, were also seen as Cold War allies.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But then they become, in the 1990s, they become the bad guys.
Right.
Mosque in Munich, the book. You remember that book?
What
The
is it?
Mosque in Munich? It actually narrates this whole story of how in the 50s and the 60s.
Oh, I'll have to look for it.
Yeah, yeah. It's called
The Mosque in Munich?
I believe. Yeah.
So you talked, thank you, by the way.
Yeah, sure.
Very interesting. You talked about sort of the overlap between the neoliberal politics between Gingrich and Abdullah. I'm wondering if there's any overlap or what Abdullah community's position was empire and like sort of post 9/11
Yeah.
policy towards the Muslim world.
There certainly wasn't a unified position within his community. His community was one that was a really diverse subset. It, was in Tribeca in downtown New York, where you've got Euro-American converts, and you've got a few African-American Muslims, and you've got Pakistani cab drivers and Senegal merchants, all in this one community. So there wasn't a unified opinion, definitely, on anything political within that community. And what I do in the book is look at some of their different debates, not about the question of empire, which actually one of them, yes, his assistant imam, I talk about that in the book, who stops being the assistant imam after publicly talking about his opinions on empire. Yes. But the average community members are not really engaging that stuff as specifically and vocally in the mosque, and that's certainly not what Abdul Rauf is trying to get them to focus on, in the mosque. He's got his own ideas about it, and he actually gets heat after the Ground Zero Mosque controversy, or during the controversy, because he had said something about U.S. foreign policy being complicit in 9/11, and so he got a lot of heat for that, right? But that was a very rare moment of criticizing U.S. foreign policy. And there's a little bit in his 2004 book, like he criticizes the fact that that civilian deaths in Iraq were described as collateral damage rather than as state-supported terrorism, basically. But it's very, very, very limited, and this criticism wasn't robust within the community. At least there was no unified position on it. Yeah.
So thank you for the presentation. Something just came up for me when you were speaking. A lot of this seems to do more so with perception than reality. And I'm wondering, when it comes to the assimilation of religious minority groups in the United States, particularly, how much of that has to do with the American conscience and memory, particularly in the West, insofar as as Westerners, we've interacted with two major empires, both being the Roman Catholic and Roman Empire, and also the impact of Catholicism in terms of its political structure, and the same thing for Islam. Whereas other religious groups that have kind of assimilated, for example, Buddhism or strains of Hinduism, we've never really interacted with those empires or any political form. And the only political form we've interacted with has been a pacifist tradition in the case of both. And so I'm just wondering if that project, that apoliticization project, was doomed from the get-go.
I think if you'd asked that question during World War II, you'd get a very different answer about Buddhists. Yeah. I think you're right. It is about perception. It's about narrative, basically, the narratives that get told, and whether these actually reveal something that was happening, or whether they're obscuring what was happening, or whether they're doing both at the same time. And I think I'm arguing more that they're doing both at the same time. There is something there to these narratives about assimilation. There is an assimilation to some extent happening, and there is a provisional acceptance being gained, but it's not necessarily because of what is being done according to the narrative. It's more because of what that narrative lets other Americans think about themselves, right? It's the work that the narrative itself is doing, not the truth of the narrative that is working. And so it is about perception, because the narrative, the story, is that certain people assimilated by dint of their own hard work, and that now, others should just do the same, and nobody should ask for handouts, and nobody should ask for anything special. And the truth is, the United States has never been that accepting of anybody. There's always been power dynamics about nationalism, and and that these narratives about acceptance and assimilation have been bids to get into the inner circle more than they have been reflections of something that actually happened.
Zero.
Yes, I was wondering if you could talk about just coming off of what you were saying now about Americans always having had this sort of nationalist, nativist strain, and it's never really been easy for any minority group to integrate into the American identity. But one thing that seems to be, maybe it's not an exact pattern, but something that Black people certainly have gone through, and Jewish people have gone through, and women, right, is periods of extreme suffering, periods of attack on the community. And that might be a starting point for the broader, for white Americans, for majority Americans, to sympathize with those communities, and then start to take more seriously the narratives that existed before them, that were created by intellectuals and authors and people who, as you talk about, are able to articulate how they believe that their communities and the identities fit into the American project. So my question is about Islamophobia, essentially. Is it the case, do you think now, that do you believe that the increase, or the sudden dramatic increase in attacks on Muslims and mosques will help to create more opening, and then sort of retroactively, people will start to go back and look at these pre-existing narratives that have been written for decades about how Islam is compatible with America?
I would like to hope that realization of suffering would open people's minds to reconsidering their biases, but I think, if anything, this history has taught me that there's nothing that's inevitable, and so I don't think that's been the reason that we've seen other groups gain provisional acceptance. And unfortunately, we can see right now that many groups that we would have claimed 2 years ago are been completely accepted in their diversity and in their assimilation to various extents, are facing extreme backlash and extreme antagonism and sometimes violence from nativist groups. And this, I think, has to make us as Americans question the stories we've been telling about ourselves, and question whether we ever have been all that accepting, and question whose suffering is getting broadcast and whose isn't. Because we talk a lot about suffering. We talk a lot about danger, about violence, about securitization, and all these things. But the question is whose lives are mattering, to put it bluntly. Yeah.
I think we thought that the Jewish Americans were fully assimilated and accepted, but it turns out in the last year or two, they have been subject to all kinds of vilification and violence.
Yeah. There was a hand back there, and then.
Thank you
very much. I look forward to reading your book.
Thank you.
You have a chapter written, The Prophet's Feminism. So I'm just wondering, just had a browse quick
Sure.
So it is, why not Muslim feminism, the title? Why did you pick up the Prophet's feminism?
It's not a theological argument at all. It's borrowing a phrase that Abdul Rauf used.
Okay.
So what that chapter is about, so that you don't waste time if you're looking for a theological argument about that, what that chapter is about how people within Abdul Rauf's community, particularly while he's increasingly gone and off on lecture tours and things like that, how people in his community are dealing with these with gender issues and with the additional scrutiny being placed on Muslims because they're supposedly anti-woman. You know, this additional scrutiny that comes in the wake of the media focus on the Taliban and the U.S. foreign policy now conscripting this idea that we're the next savior nation to go liberate women, you know. So how are local Muslims dealing with that? And how are they dealing with what else is happening at that time, which is like Amina Wadud's first, you know, female-led prayer that's happening amidst all this other political stuff. Like, how are people within the mosque dealing with this? And what I argue in that chapter is that there's ambivalence all over the place about these things, right? But what we see is not that there's a uniform, like, doctrinally women leadership is bad, doctrinally women leadership is good. We actually see this kind of complicated situation where there are female leaders. There's not, at that point, there weren't anybody giving khutbahs. The mosque that Abdul Rauf used the building was owned by a female sheikh of a different Sufi order. She and Abdul Rauf once had the same sheikh, but their Sufi orders are not connected. But anyway, she is a different situation. Abdul Rauf's community is different from hers. But what we see in this community is that whether women should be leaders is judged by the particular woman. And if the woman who is a leader is actually doing other kinds of work that is thought of as women's work, basically, like taking care of kids, doing volunteer labor, people are far less critical of her taking a public position. But if she's seen as being aggressively feminist and like not fulfilling these other female norms and not doing these other kinds of charitable things, then people are much harsher and much less likely to accept her as a female leader. So it's about the really fine politics of women's leadership in Islamic communities. Please.
When you proposed that America has never really been accepting of outsiders, my initial thought was of the Homestead Act, where someone, you know, off the boat could come and farm some land for 5 years and then it was theirs. Mm-hmm. But then when you think that was all part of a grand strategy to conquer the West from the Native Americans.
That's right. That land belonged to somebody else first. Yeah, I mean, or didn't belong maybe in the same sense, but that land was being taken from someone else. Yeah. Yeah. And it wasn't well, I guess there were some people who were direct immigrants then going directly out west. But yeah, as you said.
And, Cather's My Antonia has that theme.
And there were some, in different periods of American history, there were some people who did think that immigrants could assimilate and Americanize and all these things. And there have always been some voices to that extent. It's never been a uniform, no outsiders can come in kind of thing. But in the progressive era, those that we would call progressives were the ones that were saying, yeah, everybody can come in. As long as you become Christian, then you're basically going to be white, and so that's okay, and so just become Christian, and we can all be one happy family.
Protestant Christian.
Protestant, thank you. Thank you. Yes, that is what they meant when they said Christian. And we hear the legacy of that today, right? When you hear somebody, anytime you hear somebody say, are they Christian or are they Catholic? Where does that idea come from? That idea comes from exactly that.
I've heard the assertion that the 1924 Immigration Act that set up the national origins quota and was disadvantageous to people from Southern and Eastern Europe, but that was the most successful example of the Ku Klux Klan's political program at the time.
Well, it was influenced by eugenicists, who I'm sure the Klan were fond of, who were also getting accolades from Nazi Germany a few years later. The same pseudoscientists, the same scientists, I should say, were influencing that legislation as they were influencing Nazi ideas about eugenics. So I'm sure, the Klan probably loved them.
Do you think this acceptance problems is unique to America? Or
Certainly not.
Certainly not.
No, certainly not.
A lot of other countries, nations, Europe or even Asia, will have the same attitude.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. What's been unique to America is that we've never let ourselves admit that we have this acceptance problem. We've always portrayed ourselves as the ones who didn't have the acceptance problem. And so that has actually prohibited talking about the real politics of acceptance and exclusion and inclusion in this country, which is a little harder to ignore right now.
Okay, last question. There you
Hi, thank you.
Yeah.
Do you think that, I found it interesting, the figures you talk about, like Newt Gingrich, who've dominated segments of the conservative Republican Party in this country, have used religious Christian fervor to antagonize minorities, specifically Muslims. Do you think that same religious political capital can be used to unite, bring in, like, your book is talking about, like, moderate Islam?
Yes, I'm going to say theoretically, yes. The reason, the ripple in the matrix there is that the conservative Christians that get fired up by Gingrich and others of that ilk, and here I'm meaning Protestant evangelicals mostly, are ones who started using the Judeo-Christian terminology not because they necessarily wanted to express an acceptance and complete equality of Jews, but this started happening in the 60s to articulate their attachment to the State of Israel. And so because it was this politics, because they believe that Israel has a role in the apocalypse and the end times and all this stuff, and it's because this politics is attached to Israel that it makes it a problem for it to be funneled somehow differently, as long as there are the current politics of Israel and the U.S. relationship to Israel, and the U.S. supplying munitions for Israel, all sorts of things. As long as that obtains, and that Christian, conservative evangelical Christian belief and their love of Judaism is linked to their love of Israel, then there's going to be problems for redirecting that or broadening it to include Muslims, because there's constantly, by partners in that alliance, the figure of the automatic terrorist, Muslim terrorist, thrown up, because of the situation in Palestine. So as long as that obtains, then I say theoretically it could happen, but it seems like it might be a little difficult at the moment. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Anybody wants